Also in the spotlight, how we deal with mental illness in our court system. Douglas County prosecutors believe we're seeing more cases where mental illness becomes one of the primary issues when they make charges in a case. Prosecutors remind us their primary focus is to protect the public. Here's more from our John Chapman.
34-year-old Zachary Vinton in the Douglas County Courthouse. Prosecutors want the judge to review his $20,000 bond. On the 16th of April, law enforcement were called to a park near 196th and Y Streets. Douglas County Sheriff officials report Vinton chased two young girls in the park and tried to grab one of the girls' hair. When questioned by sheriff's deputies, Vinton denied running after the girls. He eventually admitted to chasing the girls because he wanted to have sex with them. Vinton is charged with 2 counts of child abuse. Vinton has a history of mental illness and the cognitive abilities of a 10-year-old. In court, Vinton's attorney argued, "We are not in the business of putting disabled people in jail," if there is, in fact, alternative ways to monitor his activity. But prosecutors argue an increase in bond would provide incentive for everyone to do their best to ensure all the conditions of his release are followed.
If somebody has a mental health issue, we need to figure out where that person belongs in the system. But there's also, again, the very important aspect of protecting the public, because when that person hurts somebody, it's no different than somebody else doing it.
The judge laid down very strict conditions for Vinton's continued release. Some of them include 24-hour supervision by an adult, GPS monitoring, and giving the Douglas County Sheriff access to monitoring information and compliance with all medical treatment.
The restrictions are good, they're necessary, but for us, we want to be fail-safe with regard to what happens here and make sure nothing happens to anybody else.
So far, Vinton has followed all of the judge's orders. Douglas County Attorney Don Klein says his job is to protect the public.
Certainly, we understand that sometimes people have mental health issues, but we need to protect the public no matter what the situation is. And there's got to be a way to do both. Treat somebody and make sure that the people are protected from that person if they have a propensity to do things that are against the law.
The judge called Vinton's case unique and kept the current bond in place. Vinton will stay with his caretakers and out of jail for now. In Omaha, I'm John Chapman, First Alert 6.
The judge in the case ruled bond will stay as is for now, and if any of the conditions are not met, Vinton would be rearrested and face a new hearing before the judge. Vinton has a preliminary hearing set for later this month.